No, she was in there. Yeah. She just finished her first year. It's like hearing her voice. She's in the Yeah, we were with you. Yeah. Oh, okay. I definitely like the Thanks, man. Thanks. What's your name? So yeah, like
Yeah. So, hello, good morning. So we have a guest talk today. Welcome, everyone. We have a guest talk today who's joining us currently live from Paris, and this is also broadcasted worldwide on YouTube. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Thibaut Jaulin from Sciences Po in Paris here to our class and to our campus, Carlton. And he will give a talk today on geographies of external voting, Tunisian elections abroad since the 2011 uprising. Contents we have related that are related to our class when we discussed actually North Africa and since the Arab Spring, and it's closely related. So hence it's closely related to our class, but also in another dimension it is closely related to our class because it is about the diaspora, of course, of the Tunisians in other countries of the European Union, and diasporas are today more and more important also in just like in the political system, diaspora groups have become very important, and many countries actually encourage elections, right? That the diaspora takes part of it. And you probably have heard recently about the American diaspora here in Ottawa or in Canada that registered also for taking part and voting in the elections, right? And so diasporas and voting, that's very important topics in political science, I must say, but also in migration studies, and also here in this case now, also just in European studies and relations of Europe and actually different groups living in Europe with their so-called, in quotation marks, homeland. Though sometimes we don't talk about people that have just recently immigrated, we talk about settled populations, we talk about second, third generation people that just happen to have still a relation and a passport with another country or dual citizens. So Thibaut Jaulin, he has already worked at quite a few research institutions worldwide, and he was a research fellow at the European University Institute in Florence. It's a beautiful place, a beautiful university if you ever had a chance to go to Florence, a beautiful campus. And he works currently at Sciences Po Paris, which is also a very established center for political science and migration studies. I had the pleasure to visit also a few times. And he's also well published. And the paper he's gonna present today is based on a recent article. And he has done research on not only on the Tunisian elections, but is very knowledgeable what concerns developments in Northern Africa as such. So we have also the chance actually to learn from him during discussion period then as well. I hope Thibaut can hear us and sees me at least right now.
Very well.
Awesome.
Yeah,
So,
I can see you and hear you very well.
Great, awesome. One last thing I want to mention is Thibaut provided a PowerPoint, and I uploaded a PDF version of the PowerPoint on our See Learn page, right? So instead of sharing it here on the screen, we share him. But here you can find actually on your laptop, you can pull up the PowerPoint as well. All right, and I think I'm gonna mute my microphone that it is only your voice and we have no we have better connection then. Thibaut, so the floor is yours, and thanks for doing this today for us, and welcome to the collective, and yeah, pleasure to have you here involved today.
Thank you so much. So does everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So so thank you so much for inviting me and to present my my work and my research to the class. It's okay. I thought it's a bit weird to do it live broadcast like this, but eventually it's really perfect, and I can see everybody. So it looks like it's almost real. I mean, not whatever. Hello everybody. My name is Thibaut Jaulin, and yes, I've been working on migration, diaspora issues for the last 15 years. My PhD dealt with Lebanon and the relationship between the Lebanese state and Lebanese diaspora. And then progressively, I started to look into external voting. So I will soon explain what is that exactly. And focused on the case of Tunisia, especially since the uprising. So what I'll be presenting is has been just published in a special issue on social remittances in comparative migration studies. This is an open access online journal, so you can download my paper if you wish. And it's the result of a 2-year research project funded by Marie Curie Fellowship. This is the EU funds. And so I'm very glad to present that today. So I will try to speak for no more than 25 minutes, and then we'll save time for discussions and questions. Okay, so as I said, what I looked into is external voting, meaning people, migrants or second generation citizens abroad who vote in the elections of their country of origin. And there's a developing literature on that, on the participation of citizens abroad in elections of their country of origin since, let's say, 10 years, since the early 2000s. By looking into that and through the case of Tunisia, I wish to contribute to broader academic discussions on new citizenship norms in the age of globalization, and also the extent to which migration contributes to political change in countries of origin, especially labor sending countries, but not only. So, I mean, external voting, some of you who are not, who have been living abroad, who have lived abroad, or those who are not Canadian, who have another citizenship, might have already experienced external voting if you have voted for election of your country, of another country than Canada. And it is a growing trend since the 1990s. And there's now a large majority of countries in the world that have adopted external voting provision. It's estimated to be about 120, 130 countries in the world that have such provisions. There's, as I say, the growing literature. It first includes literature in the normative political theory that mainly look at, let's say, the extent to which is it legitimate for non-resident citizens to vote and to participate by doing so in political decision. So there's especially Rainer Bobeck that has discussed that issue in several articles, and he insists on how such practice contribute to the transformations of the concept of citizenship, and how it echoes also the extension of the franchise to foreign residents for countries that have such provision, because both actually challenge the Republican conception of citizenship, according to which you need to be both a member of the political community to vote, but also simultaneously a resident of such on the territory of such political community. I will not develop that more because it will lead us too far, but just to mention it. Then the literature on external voting also explored the why and how states emphasize their citizens abroad. And also there's a small number of studies on how citizens abroad vote. Why do they vote first? And if so, how do they vote, for which parties? Is there some, what are the patterns of such, of their political behavior? And this is precisely in that trend of literature that my paper is part. So I just mentioned a few reasons, but this is not the topic of our discussion. A few reasons why states emphasize their citizens abroad, why they adopt external voting provisions. A reason that is commonly put forward is because external voting contributes to foster migrants' remittances. In other words, you give migrants voting rights, and they will be more inclined to send money back home. Okay, that might be a good reason, but there's no, I mean, the existing studies show there's no correlation between the adoption of external voting and, for example, the share of remittances in the GDP or the size of the population abroad. And of course, there's many states that are not labor-sending countries that have adopted external voting provisions. A second, let's say, range of explanation for adopting external voting is, let's say, waves of democratization since the 1990s. Again, there's a number of examples that contradicts such hypothesis, especially because external voting has also been adopted by authoritarian regimes. And this includes Tunisia, where external voting was adopted as soon as 1988 under Ben Ali regime. But it also, there's more example with Morocco, Algeria, etc. So what I think is more important is to think of the adoption of external voting as part of broader domestic political processes, from competition between political parties to broader institutional reforms, such as electoral or constitutional reform, regionalization, as in the case of Europe, etc. Another important feature of the generalization of external voting worldwide is the heterogeneity of let's say, the implementation of the practices of external voting. From one country to another, how external voting is actually implemented, and actually implemented at all, varies a lot, depending on the practicalities to cast a ballot. Is it through postal voting, electronic voting, voting in person in the consulate, or is it, for example, in polling stations set up, you know, in specific places, for example, city halls that are somehow led by the host country, but also it changed on how the ballots are counted. The external ballots are counted in domestic or in overseas constituencies. So just to sum up, somehow a genuine political participation and representation for the citizens abroad largely depend on voting procedures and on the voting system. So I say that there's a few number of studies that have started to look into the political behavior of citizens that vote from abroad, and many of these, a number of these studies suggest that actually political preferences among the electors abroad are strongly shaped prior departure, rather than resulting from their, let's say, socialization or experience gain abroad. And this is one of the arguments also that I put forward, one of the conclusions that I that I reached with the Tunisian case. And such hypothesis or such conclusion it suggests to reflect critically on the notion of political remittances. Maybe just a parenthesis to explain what is political remittances. You know, remittances is usually what the financial remittances, money sent back home by the migrants. So then scholars have progressively developed, you know, the notion of social remittances, that is to say, values, norms, idea, cultural practices, etc., that are brought back home by the migrants. So political remittances, it's, let's say, a subcategory of the social remittances that deal with political ideas, practices, and norms. So there is a number of studies that also argue that somehow political remittances can be a tool to promote democracy and civic participation in labor-sending countries. To put it very critically, it's like migrants who migrate in Western, you know, democracies, somehow socialized to democracy, and going back home, they will contribute to democratize their country that tend to be more authoritarian. So I think that the example of external voting, and when you argue that actually political preferences of external voters are shaped prior de pater rather than shaped by their experience abroad, contradict this argument, and invite you to reflect critically on that peculiar issue. So this is to give you a broader, let's say, broad introduction, you know, to debate in the literature. So now we will speak of Tunisia and of the case of Tunisia. And first, to say a few words about Tunisian migration. So as you know, other Algeria and Morocco, Tunisia, migration from Tunisia started in the early 1960s, mostly toward France, the former colonial power. And as soon as 1963, Tunisian and French government, they actively collaborated to select, to convey, and to put at work Tunisian laborers. So in other words, like controlled labor migration became through the 60s the main trend. But this changed after the oil crisis in 1973 because Western France, as other Western countries, they put an end to such, you know, controlled labor migration, or let's say organized labor migration, and to agreement with Tunisia and other countries. And one of the consequences was that migrants settled in their host country, contrary to what was actually expected, and they benefited from family reunification schemes, so that the demographic and social characteristics of migrant communities from North Africa in Europe changed. But in parallel, in the 1970s and 80s, Tunisian migrants, as other Arab migrants, gradually, you know, started to go to the Arab Gulf and to Libya, to Arab oil-producing countries, because, of course, of you know, large development program that was funded by the oil revenues, and so the need for foreign labor force. The second wave of Tunisian migration was in the 1990s, when there was a new upsurge of migration, mainly among university graduates due to unemployment, the lack of employment opportunities. And the main difference between the first and the second wave is that the second wave is characterized by greater diversity in regard with destination countries. So now France is still the main country for Tunisian migration. You know, it's half of Tunisian migrants in the world are in France, but other countries, in particular Italy, have become more and more important since the 90s. So Italy is the second. It's the country where there's the second largest Tunisian community, but there's also many Tunisian migrants in Canada and in the States, especially highly skilled ones. So now we have a population, Tunisian population abroad, that, okay, is estimated. You know, I'm not going to talk about migration statistics here, but if you had a class on that, you will understand why I can say that it's estimated between 600,000 and 1.2 million, depending on who counts. So whatever. But what is, I think, more important, that the exact figure, is to have in mind that it's about 10%, you know, of the population, a bit less, a bit more, the Tunisian population. So I mean, it's clearly a labor-sending country, and that is with mostly people, communities in France, and then Italy, Germany, Libya, Arab Gulf, and North America. Okay, I'm not going to talk what I've been doing, what I do in the paper about, you know, the adoption of external voting in Tunisia by Ben Ali and then after the revolution, just to discuss and look directly at the voter turnout and then the voting preferences of the Tunisians abroad. So the first thing that is striking with the voter turnout, and you can open the table 1 of the PowerPoint that of the PDF that was distributed, is the first thing that is striking is that if you look at the 2 elections that happened since the uprising, the 2011 election for the Constituent Assembly and the 2014 election for Parliament and President, there's a striking difference between the number of voters abroad. 210,000, sorry, in 2011, and about half of that 3 years later. So there's here, well, I mean, we can really, you know, argue and think. I mean, the first hypothesis would be that there was, you know, let's say, a short-lived awareness period among the Tunisians abroad in the context of the Arab Spring for the politics and for the elections of their country of origin, and this short-lived awareness period just somehow folded after in 2000, 3 years later, in a context where it was much less, let's say, publicized and much less somehow interesting. So this is also an interesting characteristic with diaspora politics in general, not only election, that you can have short-lived awareness periods due to specific events. It can be you know, political events, but it can be also, you know, I don't know, earthquake or whatever, but this then falls out progressively. Whatever, in the case of the election, what I think it's important to insist on is that voting procedures, changing voting procedures from 2011 to 2014 had also a great impact. In 2011, and this is true both at home and abroad, the Tunisian authority were really willing to have a very broad participation, you know, as a demonstration of the support of the population for the revolution, for the political transition. And then it changed in 2014 when they decided that they needed to have much more strict, let's say, procedures in order who is allowed to vote. And so, to put it clearly, in 2011 you could vote even if you were not registered on the electoral rolls, just with an a Tunisian ID or passport, while in 2014 you had to register prior to the election on the electoral roll. And this had a great impact, I think, even a great impact on voter turnout, and most probably a greater impact on the voter turnout abroad than at home, due to obvious logistical constraints, abroad, because you have less, let's say, registration pools, etc., etc. So, whatever. What I think, which is also interesting, what the tables show, what is interesting, even if we have problems in measuring exactly the voter turnout, is that there is two groups of country among the overseas constituencies. So I did not explain, but I think you understood that in the case of Tunisia, since 2011, you have 6 overseas constituencies to elect 18 overseas representatives. And these 6 overseas constituencies have been drawn depending, of course, of the dispersion of the Tunisian in the world. There's 2 constituencies for France, France 1 and France North. This is northern half and southern half. And then you have constituency for Italy, for Germany, and then 2 constituencies that are made of various countries. One with Americas, both North and South America, and the rest of Europe, and the 6th constituency, which is Arab countries and the rest of the world. So this is a bit weird, both in regard with demography and geography, but whatever. So in this, if you look at these different constituencies and the voter turnout, you realize that there's 3 constituencies, Germany, Italy, and France too, where the voter turnout is, sharply and constantly below the average, and 3 other constituencies where this is France 1, France, North America, rest of Europe, and Arab countries, where the voter turnout is, clearly and constantly above the average. So it suggests, that if you think of, let's say, the background, the socioeconomic background of the Tunisian migrants in each of these constituencies, it suggests that, for example, the turnout tend to be higher in countries like North America that favor high-skill migration or migration of semi-skilled professionals, such as the Arab Gulf. And while, in contrast, the turnout tend to be lower in countries like Italy, which massively attracted low-skill migrants in the 1990s. So, and similarly, such hypothesis also explain the gap between France 1 and 2, because within France you have different migration patterns, with, for example, Paris attracting more students and skilled migrants than the southern part of France. So, in other words, to sum up, we could hypothesize that socioeconomic variables, the socioeconomic profile of the migrants, have a great impact on the voter turnout abroad, as it has an impact at home. So there's the same here pattern that is repeated abroad. Now, when you look the second in the time that is left, we will look at political preferences, among the Tunisians abroad, and we will look at 3 different levels. The first one is, to compare voting behavior at home and voting behavior in Tunisia. So this is table 2, and here what is striking is that there's actually, the results of the main parties, which is Ennahda, the Islamist party, and Nida Tunis, the so-called secular party, are quite similar at home and abroad, and they follow the same trend from one election to the other. Okay, so In other words, a Tunisian abroad, they vote like Tunisians at home. There is, however, some differences between overseas constituencies and Tunisian at home and Tunisian abroad, and this has to do with medium-sized and small-sized parties. Because we have not a lot of time left, I will not discuss more that issue, but we can come back to it in the discussion. The second level of analysis, this is to look at each overseas constituencies. So you can look at map 1, 2, and 3, so in these maps, I have tried, to found some sort of solution that is tailored, to the heterogeneous size and shape of these overseas constituencies and the unequal dispersion of the Tunisian abroad in each constituency. So you can see so that the circles obviously, show the importance, the numbers corresponds to the number of voters in each constituency. Map 1 and 2 compares the result of Ennahda in 2011 and 2014, so the Islamist party. And what is striking is that there is a clear, the pattern, of the map is consistent from one election to the other. So Ennahda has systematically results that are above the average in Italy, in Germany, and the Arab countries, rest of the world, while the results, the Ennahda's results, are always below the average in France, both North and South, and Americas and rest of Europe. And conversely, if you look at map 3, which the result of Nida Tunis, the opponent to Ennahda in 2014, you can see that it's quite the reverse. So there's what is here interesting. I think there's clear, a geographic pattern in regard with the voting behavior of the Tunisian abroad in the overseas constituencies. I think it calls for more research, on migrants' transnational voting behavior. But clearly, as I mentioned it, for the voter turnout, you can, somehow, if not correlate, associate these variation, these differences with, the profile, the migrants' profile in each country. So what I think is here interesting for the argument is to say that that there's Tunisian who are based in Western countries do not always vote for secular parties that supposedly share the same, values of such countries, and nor they systematically reject, Islamist conservative parties that supposedly do not share the values of these countries. This is very schematic way to say it, but I think here there's some grounds to more reflection. Okay, I just take 3 more minutes to show you, to discuss the third level of analysis, and this is the map 4, 5, and 6. Sorry, and here I looked at the region of Paris and suburbs, so the Île-de-France. And here you have the bulk of the Tunisian voters in the constituency of France 1. About 80% of the voters of the constituency of France 1 are based in the region of Paris and and so it's quite representative of it's a large number of voters. And what is interesting in this map, so again you have the results of Ennahda's in 2011 and 2014, and then that of Nida Tunis, the opponent, 2014. And what is striking is that you have again a very strong geographic pattern, which actually reflects the socio-territorial inequalities of the region, you know, inner city opposed to suburbs, east opposed to west, and this pattern that appear on the map are exactly the same one that you can find when you look at broader socioeconomic inequalities, territorial socioeconomic inequalities in the region. So, I mean, what it says is that somehow, you know, if it fits quite well with this hypothesis according to which the voters' socioeconomic background primarily influences their political preferences, and that voting behavior has strongly shaped prior departure. But I think that it also, you know, suggests to explore the extent to which the local context in which migrants are embedded has an influence on their electoral preferences. What I mean is that it calls for more research on the role of community organization, especially the relation, you know, with parties, political parties at home, and potentially the support to candidates abroad. But also it calls for more research on how, you know, family, friends, colleagues, both at home and abroad, contribute to shape electoral participation and political preferences in a transnational context. What I mean is to explore how mutual exchanges and influence among relatives at home and abroad influence the transnational electors' choice. And lastly, and I will conclude with that, I think it also invites us to think and maybe explore better the relationship between transnational electoral participation, so voting at home, and voting in the home country. I mean, among the Tunisian in France especially, there's a large number, this is about half of the community, that have the French citizenship and who vote at the French election. So also more research, I think, is here needed to look at, you know, the relationship between political preferences at home and political preferences in the host country. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope the connection was good enough for you to follow, and I'm open here for questions. I can hear you. I cannot hear you. There's no mic. Yeah. there's a first diaspora groups, the impact of diaspora groups in social media. Yeah. So I mean, of course, social media has a great role abroad, because somehow it's a substitute for a lot of logistical difficulties. I mean, campaigning abroad, for example, it's much more difficult for obvious reasons than campaigning back home, because of the dispersion of the migrants, because you're in a foreign territory somehow, so you in some cases have to require the authorization of the authorities. So social media, in that sense, can help. I hope this is how you think of the question. But still, I think you should not, overemphasize the importance of social media in that sense, because when I looked at Tunisian campaigns in Paris, for example, what was also very important was for the candidate and for their supporters to be well positioned in places where the community, habitually gather. So a specific neighborhood, in front of the mosque, or in front of the consulate, or the Tunisian cultural center, or a specific market, this kind of thing. So there's still a lot of let's say real interactions that takes place. So I hope I understood well the question. Maybe it was, if it's not the case, just let me know. Okay, so there's another question about the return of migrants to Tunisia. What is specific with Tunisia is that because the former regime was authoritarian, you had a lot of exilés, political exilés, in France, and more generally in Europe and North America. Especially was let's say, two group of exilés, political exilés. On the one hand, those that belonged quite broadly to, let's say, the more leftist sphere, and many of them were in France or in other countries for many years, since 30 years. Maybe they came, as students in the 60s or 70s, and then, engaged into politics. So they did not. Their situation was more that they could not come back, rather than having departed because they were expelled, and the other group was that of the Islamists, and they have been persecuted, by Ben Ali regime starting the 1990s, and so they left Tunisia in their case, and somehow reform their political party, the political structure abroad. So most of these, let's say, political activists went back after the revolution. So I mean, some of them did not, but this is rather the exception, and most of them went back. So I would say that the influence of the diaspora, it's huge if you want to consider these political exilés as a diaspora member. But I mean, this is all about how you define diaspora. And yeah, I mean, the second part of the question, maybe I did not fully answer, was about the influence on democracy, and here it's a quite difficult question to answer. I don't think that there's a clear, let's say, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, some you know, some Tunisian politician will tell that yes, this is because I was in France or abroad, you know, and I was engaged into local democracy, for example, that I learned, you know, a number of practices and values and norms, and this, you know, helped me when I was back in Tunisia to build somehow the democracy that exists now. But I mean, it's hard to say. It's not the diaspora itself. I mean, on the other hand, those who did the revolution and you know, put Ben Ali's regime down were the people within. So I mean, this should not be underestimated. And the people, the opponent that stayed in Tunisia were at the end those who took maybe the greater part in the revolution and then in the transition. But it plays a role, of course. Yes. There's more question. It's a bit weird because I don't hear you and I don't know what is happening in the class if someone is talking or not. So, but well, I pretend I do. Okay. So do I think, if I think that the voting behavior would be replicated in other diasporas other than Tunisia? Yes, I think that, yeah, I believe that what that, yeah, I mean, voting preferences tend to be shaped pre your departure. I think that they tend to replicate, you know, voting preferences at home in general in Tunisia as in other diaspora. I mean, the question that is, you know, the question that it raises is, you know, how the relationship between migration as a selection process and voting preferences. I mean, the people that migrate to the same place share same, you know, characteristic, and thus vote the same way, to put it briefly. So I think here that there's a strong somehow, let's say, pattern, yeah, that because migration is a selection process, then there's an impact on there's a direct impact on voting preferences within diaspora. Now, of course, there are a number of cases where, of Romania, for example, where the diaspora, you know, the voting preferences of the diaspora is quite clearly identified, and so and it's much more homogeneous than in the case of Tunisia. But this also has to do with the history of Romanian migration. And again, I think that here, voting preferences are set prior departure. But still, it doesn't mean that, I think it means that as broad as I argued, host country does not have an impact when you look at broad features such as, I don't know, democracy, level of development, etc. But I think still it has the context, let's say the local context in which migrants are embedded has an impact. And this is quite clear when you look at the strategy of the political parties when they campaign abroad. They are very much aware on, of the composition of the social composition of the social characteristics of the Tunisians abroad, and so they adapt to that, and they will try to campaign in a specific neighborhood where they know that they will meet specific kinds of migrants that are more that share their view, for example, that have preferences for them. So this is quite clear when you look at party strategies. So the local context has a great impact, but not broader features such as I said, level of development or level of democracy in the host country. At least this is what I believe. Yeah, okay. Okay, so I wait for a second question. Okay, so there's two different questions. The first, it's, I have two passports. Why would it be important for immigrants to vote if they don't plan to go back to that country? So it's about the legitimacy of non-resident citizens voting. And the second one, different on how have parties been changing their campaign with this. For the first one, I think this is really, as I said, it deals with, normative political theory. You could put forward a number of good and bad reasons, maybe it's important because even if you don't leave or don't plan to go back, you have, I don't know, a home back home for which you pay taxes, or maybe your children will decide to go back, etc. There's a number of reasons. In contrast, there's a number of obvious reasons why you should not vote, because especially the main one being that why would you contribute to decide for laws that will not apply to you? So, but beyond that, as I said, it really, I think it really has to do, the discussion has to do with, citizenship conceptions and norms, and how you conceive citizenship and what is citizenship. And I mean, I suggest you read Rainer Burbach's publication, which are very interesting. Then regarding parties, they try to adapt, but actually I think it's something very new for them, and for the moment they don't really know how to deal with that. There are obvious logistical issues. Small parties, for example, they don't have enough funds, enough money, or even enough, let's say, manpower to campaign abroad. So they just abandon these overseas constituencies. Larger parties, they try different things, but you can feel that they don't have a clear strategy. What is interesting is that you realize that they try through this adaptation process, they somehow experience new kind of collaboration with community organization, I mentioned it, but also with, let's say, organization of the host countries that have nothing to do with the country of origin. It can be, of course, okay, in the case of the Islamist Party, religious Muslim organization in France, but not only. It can be also French political parties, for example, and yeah. So there's this let's say attempts, and they are trying. Yeah, it's interesting. It's really something that is in process. They are building strategies. Okay, there's I see another question. I hope we still have time. I don't know when your class is supposed to end. This is the last question. Okay. So how will diaspora voting be affected due to new refugee flows? And this is, yeah, a very interesting question, because thinking of, the legitimacy of voting for non-resident citizens, there's one category of migrant for whom almost everybody agreed that they should vote. These are refugees, especially in context of political transition or political reconciliation. So when you think of the Syrians, for example, Syrian refugees, if at a certain point you would have, a transition toward a new regime, then refugees should have the right to vote. And there's, interestingly, since the 1990s, the IOM, International Organization for Migration, has developed a so-called out-of-country voting program that was primarily targeted at refugees. So first from former Yugoslavia, but then also from Afghanistan, and then Iraq, after the Gulf War, the second Gulf War, etc., etc. So diaspora voting is clearly, affected by these refugee flows, that in the sense that it highlights its importance. Okay, bye-bye. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye then.